In this video, we will be taking a look at the mapper block, Canvas's built-in tool for mapping and transforming data passed between applications. We will cover several topics, including more advanced scenarios using JavaScript functions in the mapping. Before we begin, I will mention that the mapper block will be undergoing some design changes in the near future, so depending on when you're viewing this video, it might look and act a bit differently from what you see here. If you have any questions or suggestions, please reach out to us. While it's certainly possible to map data through just coding, the mapper block lets you visually construct a mapping table, using drag and drop to transform and combine data from one or many data sources, and to output the result as structured data for your target application. In this case, we have an input and an output. So to map between them, we drag in the mapper block. And we set the input and the output. When I press Map Model, Canvas will dynamically sample the incoming data to construct a list of available fields. You will then be presented with the mapper block editor. You can think of this sort of like an Excel spreadsheet, where you have a source and a target column, allowing you to map between the inputs and the outputs. In most cases, you can quite simply drag and drop to map the fields of the source to the target. You can also add static values. But in some cases, you will need to transform the data. Here we have a first name and a last name in the incoming data, but the target column only has a full name field. So to map between them, we first need to combine the first and last name into the full name. This can be achieved quite easily with a function. The function would take the first name and the last name and produce a new field for the combined name, which we can use in the mapping table. To do that, I press the plus sign on the parent array to add a new field, and I select function. Here you'll find a long list of functions that you can use in your mapping table. You can create your own, or you can ask us to add new functions for you. In this case, I'll be using the concatenate function, which can be used to combine two strings. First, I give the function a name, and then I have to specify the strings to be combined. So I drag in the first name and the last name. When combined, I want a space in between the names. So in the delimiter field, I'll simply put in a space and press enter. If I save this, I'll now see a new field available, the combined name, which I can drag and drop and map to the full name field. Now let's save and test our new mapping. Press save the workflow, and then I can press this drop down and select special run. This lets me select the first two blocks and do a partial run of only those two. If I click the results, I see the incoming data with the first name and the last name, but the output from the mapper will have a full name, which is combined. Now let's try to run the last block. I see we've encountered a validation error, saying that the date has to be formatted in a certain way. The dates in the input data have a different format, so we need to use a function to transform the date formats before passing it on. To do that, we head back into the mapper, and then press the plus sign on the array to add another field, choose function, and search for date-time format. This function takes a date string and a format string as inputs, and it outputs the date in the format specified. I'll drag that in, give it a name, and I'll specify the output format as an ISO standard datetime string, as required by the target API. Now I can use the new reformatted birth date field and drag that into the mapping table. Now when we run the integration again, we see that the mapper outputs the correct datetime format and that the results are accepted by the API. Now, of the incoming date fields, I'm currently only using the birth date. But if I wanted to use the leave date in the mapping, I would have to repeat the same steps to set up the same function. But it can be simplified a bit, so let me show you. I can create a constant which can be shared across functions. I'll specify the datetime format as a function, which I'll name myDateFormat. I'll save that. Now I have a constant which I can use across my functions. Now, if I edit my function for the reformatted birth date, I can change this to using my datetime format constant. So now if I set up another function for the leave date, I can use the same constant in this function. So now I have two functions both using my constant for the datetime format. So currently the active field is being set to true for all employees, but let's imagine that I want the mapper to evaluate the leave date to set the active status to true only if the leave date is in the future, otherwise set it to false. Again, this can be achieved with a function. So if I press the plus sign, I choose function, I can search for is older than. The is older than function returns true if the first date provided is older than the second date provided. So for the first date, I'll provide the leave date. But for the second date, I should provide the current time to be able to evaluate if the leave date is in the past or not. But I do not have the current time available for mapping. So I'll back up and set that up first. I'll search for the UTC-now function. The UTC-now function just returns the current date and time in the UTC time zone in an ISO format. I'll save that. And now I have a UTC-now field available, which just provides the current time. So now if I try to set up the is older than function again, for the first date I can use the leave date, and for the second date I can use the UTC-now value. I'll name the function and press save. Now I can remove my fixed true value and drag in my new field called evaluated leave date, which will return true if the leave date is in the future, otherwise it will return false. I'll save it and do a test. And now I see that the active status is set to true or false, depending on whether or not the leave date is in the past or in the future. So far, we've only worked with one data source, but you'll often find that you have to combine several data sources in the mapping table. So here we've introduced a second data source, which simply provides a department ID for each employee. So now the challenge is to update the mapper block to pull data from two sources and to match the departments to the employees by comparing the employee ID. So first, let's configure the mapper and add the second data source. The mapper can have several inputs, but will only have one output. Now, unfortunately, when I press Map Model, the data from the Get Departments block is not shown in the incoming data hierarchy. This is something we're working to improve, but there's currently two ways to handle this. If I click Reset Mappings and Models, the mapping table will be reset when I click Map Model, meaning we'll lose everything that we've created so far, but the data hierarchy will show the Get Departments data. An alternative would be to add it manually. So I can manually add a new root field and select Type, Property, Array, and name it Get Departments. And to this, I can manually add the two fields available from the Get Departments block. Now that I have my incoming data set up, I'll create the function to match data between them. I'll press the plus sign on the Get Employees array, and again, choose Function. For this, I'll be using the Find function. Now this one is a little bit more complex, so feel free to get in touch if you get stuck. But essentially, for each employee, the function will check the department's data and return the first item where the employee ID matches the employee ID of the current employee being processed. If there's a match, we will return an object. So now, under the employee hierarchy, there's a new object called FoundDepartment. Now the target column does not show a department ID field, but I know that the API supports it, so I'll just add it manually. So now I can drag the department ID of the matched department and put that into the target department ID field. If I save this, now if I run it, I'll see that for each employee ID, the corresponding department ID is found by the mapper. Now, as we just saw, the department ID field was not included by default in the target column, so we had to add it manually. This is because the field is missing in the target block's input model. Each block in Canvas has an input model and an output model. While the input model describes the field and field names that can be passed to a block, the output model describes what you can expect to get out of the block. The mapper block uses these models to construct the initial list of fields for the mapping table. While the mapper block can dynamically sample incoming data, it has to know in advance what kind of data it should pass on. For that reason, a block's output model is not as important as a block's input model, especially for blocks that will be sending data to an API in a required format. So let's edit the input model for the post employees block to add the missing field. To do that, head to the workbench and then blocks. Search for the post employees block and click edit. In the input model editor, you can see the structure that this block expects as input. These are the fields that will be shown by default in the target column in the mapper block when sending data to this block. I'll press save, head back to Workbench, and then commit the changes. We appreciate your feedback as we're working to improve the mapper block, so please get in touch if you have any questions or suggestions.